My husband brought his mistress into our home while I was in the hospital. My neighbor sent me a video. I didn't respond. I simply made one phone call. The next morning, people stormed into our house and... Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Whitfield. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago what my life looked like, I would have smiled and told you. Pretty good. Better than most, maybe. I had a house in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio. A brick colonial with a front porch and a Japanese maple in the yard that turned the most outrageous shade of red every October. I had a job I was proud of, managing accounts for a mid-sized logistics firm. I had 2 kids in middle school, Maya and Ethan, both of them loud and healthy and exhausting in the best possible way. And I had a husband, Daniel, 12 years of marriage, a man who coached Little League on Saturdays and grilled salmon on Sunday evenings and kissed me on the forehead when he thought I was already asleep. That was the Daniel I thought I knew. Looking back now, I can see exactly where the cracks began. But at the time, I was too busy living to notice the ground shifting beneath my feet. It started small. Isn't it always small? A new password on his phone. Not unusual by itself. He'd changed it before when he got a new device. But this time, when I casually asked, he got defensive in a way that felt off. Clipped. I just updated it, Claire. It's not a big deal. And it wasn't, I told myself. It wasn't. Then came the late nights. His firm was going through a restructuring, and the overtime made sense. At first. But after 6 weeks of him coming home past 9, smelling of nothing in particular, eating reheated dinners in silence while staring at his phone under the table, something in me started paying closer attention. Not with suspicion exactly. More like a low hum at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite turn off. The gym bag. That was the one that made me pause longest. Daniel had never been a gym person. In 12 years of marriage, the man's idea of exercise was carrying groceries from the car. But one Thursday in September, he came home with a brand new gym bag, black, expensive looking, and told me he was starting to work out with a colleague. Good for you, I said, and I meant it. Except that 3 weeks later, when I was searching for Maya's soccer cleats in the hall closet, I found the bag shoved behind a stack of boxes. Dry. Clean. Not a drop of sweat on it. I didn't say anything. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear what might come out of his mouth if I did. And then, in early October, I got sick. It wasn't dramatic. A gallbladder issue that had been creeping up on me for months finally demanded attention. The surgery itself was routine, but the recovery was harder than the doctor had predicted. I ended up staying in the hospital for 5 days instead of 2. Daniel visited. He brought flowers the first day, yellow tulips, my favorite, and sat with me for an hour, scrolling through his phone while I dozed. He came back on day 3 briefly and said the kids were fine and the house was fine and I should focus on resting. By day 4, he stopped coming. He texted, said work was impossible, said the kids needed him home, said he'd be there to pick me up when I was discharged. I lay in that hospital bed staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles, and I told myself, he's stressed. He's handling everything alone. Give him grace. My neighbor, Sandra Park, gave me something else entirely. Sandra and I had been friendly for years, the kind of neighbors who wave from driveways and share tomatoes from the garden and text each other when a package is delivered. She wasn't a gossip. That's the first thing you need to understand about her. She wasn't the type to stir things up for entertainment. So when my phone lit up at 8:47 p.m. on my fourth night in the hospital, and I saw it was Sandra calling, I answered without a second thought. She didn't say much, just, "Claire, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. I took a video. I'm sending it to you right now." The video was 43 seconds long. It was shot from Sandra's upstairs window, looking down at our driveway. The timestamp in the corner read 6:14 p.m., and there was Daniel, my Daniel, with his new haircut and his good jacket, helping a woman carry bags into our house, the one with the Japanese maple and the front porch, and 12 years of our life inside it. The woman was blonde, maybe 30, laughing at something he said as she grabbed a tote bag from the back seat. He put his hand on the small of her back as they walked to the door, and then the door closed behind them both. I watched it twice, 3 times. I set the phone face down on the bedside table. I looked at the IV in the back of my hand. I listened to the monitor beside me, steady and indifferent, and I breathed. I didn't call him. I didn't text Sandra back. I didn't cry. Not then, not yet. Something cold and very clear moved through me instead, the way ice water moves through a glass, and I thought, with absolute calm, I need to think before I do anything at all. I turned the phone back over. I watched the video one more time, and then I made a decision that would change everything that came after. I said nothing. I simply waited. They discharged me on a Tuesday morning. Daniel picked me up right on schedule, standing at the hospital entrance with a coffee from the good place down the street, looking like a man with nothing on his conscience. He hugged me carefully, mindful of the incision. He carried my bag. He asked how I was feeling 3 times on the drive home. I answered all 3 times. I watched his hands on the steering wheel, and I thought about the 43-second video still sitting on my phone. The house looked exactly as it always had. That was the strangest part. I don't know what I expected. Some visible trace, some proof written into the walls. But everything was in its place. The kids ran to me the moment I walked in, and I held them both for a long time, longer than usual, pressing my face into Ethan's hair. Maya made me tea without being asked. These were my children. This was my house. I had paid half the mortgage on it for 12 years. I spent the first 2 days recovering in bed, genuinely exhausted, letting the pain medication do its work. Daniel was attentive in a way that felt almost performative, bringing soup, adjusting my pillows, checking in every few hours. I let him. I watched him. I kept my face smooth and my voice even, and I gave him absolutely nothing to read. On the 3rd night after the kids were asleep, I lay in the dark and I started to count. Not the emotional losses. Those were too large to look at directly yet. I mean the practical ones. The concrete, legal, financial reality of what my marriage actually looked like on paper. The house was in both our names. Our joint savings account held just over $60,000. I had my own income, not enormous but solid, around $78,000 a year. Daniel made more, close to $110,000. We had 2 car loans, a mortgage with 14 years left on it, and retirement accounts we'd each contributed to separately. What did I actually have? What could he take? That question kept me awake until nearly 3 in the morning. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it settles in like a low-grade fever. Not dramatic, not paralyzing, but always there, just beneath everything. I was afraid of losing the house. I was afraid of what a drawn-out custody fight would do to Maya and Ethan. I was afraid of being wrong, of having misread the video, of blowing up my family over 43 seconds of footage that might somehow have an innocent explanation. But I was more afraid of doing nothing. Because here's what I knew. in the cold, clear part of my brain that had been running quietly ever since that hospital night. A man who brings a woman into his family home while his wife is in surgery, recovering, doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt, and a woman who pretends otherwise is only delaying her own damage. So I made a decision, not a reckless one, a methodical one. Step 1. I needed documentation before I touched anything. I called a divorce attorney. Not a friend's recommendation, not a name from a billboard. I researched. I spent 2 hours on my laptop while Daniel was at work reading reviews, checking bar association records, looking at outcomes. I found a woman named Patricia Holt, a family law attorney in Columbus with 19 years of experience and a reputation for being precise, thorough, and unsentimental. I called her office from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house, and made an appointment for the following Thursday. Step 2. I needed to understand what I was dealing with financially before he could move anything. That same day, I pulled up every account I had access to online. Joint checking, joint savings, my individual retirement account, the kids' college funds, which were in my name. I took screenshots of every balance, every recent transaction, every statement I could access. I saved them to a folder on a cloud account Daniel didn't know existed, one I'd set up years ago for work files and never mentioned at home. Step 3. The video. I forwarded it to that same cloud account. I also texted Sandra and asked if she still had the original on her phone. She did. I asked her to back it up and not delete it. She asked if I was okay. I said I was working on it. She said, "Whatever you need, Claire, I mean it." I believed her. Step 4, and this was the hardest one, was deciding what face to wear at home. I couldn't let Daniel know what I knew. Not yet. Not before I had spoken to Patricia Holt and understood my legal position. Any confrontation now, before I had documentation and counsel, could only hurt me. He might move money. He might get his own attorney first. He might try to establish a narrative before I had a chance to establish mine. So I came home that evening and I made dinner. I set the table. I called the kids. I poured Daniel a glass of the red wine he liked, and when he kissed me on the cheek and said, "You seem better today," I smiled and told him I was feeling stronger. Every word of it was true. I was feeling stronger, just not in the way he thought. The plan was forming. It was still rough, still incomplete, but it was there. A shape in the dark that was becoming more defined with every passing hour. I had a lawyer's appointment. I had documentation. I had a neighbor with a video. And I had something Daniel had clearly underestimated from the very beginning. I had patience. Patricia Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, spare and functional, with none of the performative warmth some attorneys put on for frightened clients. I appreciated that immediately. She shook my hand across a clean desk, opened a legal pad, and said, "Tell me everything, and don't edit it." So I did. I told her about the 12 years, the house, the kids, the finances. I told her about the late nights and the gym bag that never got used. I told her about the hospital, the tulips, the video. I showed her the video on my phone. She watched it once, made a note, and said, "Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, so adultery doesn't affect the divorce itself directly. But it may be relevant to certain asset arguments, and it's highly relevant to establishing the moral and factual context of your marriage's breakdown. Keep that video safe." I told her I already had 3 copies. For the first time in 2 weeks, something in me loosened, just slightly. Not because Patricia Holt was warm, she wasn't particularly, but because she was competent, and I was so desperately tired of feeling like I was operating in the dark alone. She walked me through the basics, In Ohio, marital assets are divided equitably, which doesn't always mean equally. The house, the savings, his pension, my retirement account, all of it was in play. Given that the children were minors and I was the parent with the more stable schedule, I had a reasonable argument for primary custody, though Daniel would likely receive significant parenting time. She told me to document my daily involvement with the children, school pickups, medical appointments, homework, activities, starting immediately. I went home and started a log that same afternoon. Meanwhile, I kept living the performance. Dinner, homework, bedtime routines, weekend errands. I sat next to Daniel on the couch on Friday night and watched a movie I have absolutely no memory of, because I was spending the entire 2 hours mentally cataloging every account, every asset, every decision we had made together that I would now need to untangle. He fell asleep before the credits. I watched him sleep and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not grief, just distance, the feeling of already being somewhere else. It was around this time that something shifted on Daniel's end. I noticed it first on a Wednesday. He came home and was unusually quiet through dinner, watching me in a way I'd never quite seen from him before. Not guilty quiet, watchful quiet. Like he was trying to read something in my face. I gave him nothing. But after the kids were in bed, he said, almost casually, "Have you talked to Sandra lately?" I looked up from the book I was pretending to read. "Not really. Why?" "Just asking," he said, and he went back to his phone. But I felt it, the small shift in air pressure. Someone had said something, or he had noticed something, or the woman in the video had begun to feel anxious about the quietness coming from my direction. I went to bed that night and updated my cloud folder, adding 3 new screenshots of account activity. I wasn't moving money yet. Patricia had told me not to, not without her guidance, but I was documenting everything. The direct evidence came 10 days after my attorney appointment. Patricia had recommended as a precaution that I note whether Daniel's phone behavior had changed. It had. He was increasingly careful, phone always face down, stepped outside for certain calls. But one afternoon, when he was in the shower and had left his jacket over a dining room chair, his phone buzzed twice in quick succession, and the screen lit up with a preview long enough for me to read without touching the device. "You left your charger here again. Also, is she suspicious? You've been weird." The contact name was saved as Mark W. There was no Mark W. in Daniel's life that I knew of. He had a colleague named Marcus, a neighbor named Mike, a college friend named Matt. No Mark. I photographed the screen preview with my own phone before it went dark. I forwarded it to the cloud folder. Then I called Patricia's office and left a message with her paralegal, telling her I had a new piece of documentation. That evening, Patricia called me back. "This establishes awareness," she said. "She knows you exist. She knows the situation is precarious, and they are communicating about you. This is relevant. Are you ready to move to the next phase?" I said yes. "Then here's what we're going to do," she said. She walked me through the filing timeline. We would file for divorce and simultaneously request an automatic temporary restraining order, standard in Ohio divorce proceedings, which would freeze both parties from moving or dissipating marital assets. This would prevent Daniel from draining the joint accounts the moment he received the papers. It would also, she noted calmly, come as a significant shock to a man who clearly believed his wife had no idea what was happening. "He's going to find out," she said. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the tulips. I thought about the hand on the small of a stranger's back. I thought about lying in a hospital bed watching 43 seconds of footage while a monitor beeped beside me. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." We filed on a Thursday morning. Patricia's office handled the paperwork. The sheriff's department would serve Daniel at his workplace. Her recommendation, not mine, but I didn't argue. It was cleaner, more formal. It would happen on a Tuesday, 2 weeks out. I drove home from Patricia's office on a gray November afternoon, and I thought, this is the point of no return. There was no walking this back, no pretending, no more performances over dinner. I wasn't afraid. I was, for the first time in weeks, entirely certain. The papers were served on a Tuesday, just as Patricia had said. I was at work when it happened. I know because Daniel called me 40 minutes after I arrived at my desk. Not texting, calling, which he almost never did during work hours. I let it ring. He called again. I let that one ring too. On the third call, I picked up. His voice was something I had never heard from him before. Not angry. Not yet. Something tighter than that. Controlled in the way that things are controlled right before they break. "What did you do, Claire?" Not a question. A statement with an edge on it. "I filed for divorce," I said. "You'll receive the paperwork. Your attorney can contact Patricia Holt." Silence. Then, "We need to talk. Tonight. Before you do anything else." "I've already done everything else," I said. "Call your attorney, Daniel." And I hung up. My hands were steady. I noticed that, specifically, I had expected them to shake, but they didn't. I took a breath, pulled up the account I was supposed to be working on, and I went back to work. That evening was when the escalation began. Daniel came home 3 hours earlier than usual, and he didn't come alone. He came with his mother, Roberta Whitfield, a woman I had managed a careful, cordial relationship with for 12 years, who had never particularly liked me and had never worked very hard to hide it. She walked into my house, our house, with the expression of someone arriving to reclaim something that had been temporarily misplaced. "I think we all need to sit down," Roberta said, in her very particular way that made every suggestion sound like a summons. The kids were at my mother's. I had arranged that. We sat, and then they began. Daniel's version was that I had blindsided him, that I had gone nuclear without any conversation, that he deserved the chance to explain. Roberta's version was that I was being vindictive and irrational, and that this was going to destroy the children. They took turns, the two of them, tag-teaming the table in a way that told me clearly this conversation had been rehearsed. I let them finish. Then I said, "Daniel, I watched you bring her into this house while I was recovering from surgery. I have the video. My attorney has the video. We can discuss everything through counsel." Roberta's face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Daniel leaned forward. His voice dropped. "If you push this, you need to understand what happens. I will fight for the house. I will fight for 50-50 with the kids. And I will make sure everyone, your firm, your clients, everyone, knows that you fabricated evidence because you couldn't handle a struggling marriage." There it was, the threat beneath the conversation. I looked at him across the table that we had bought together at a salvage market in 2014, that I had refinished myself over a long weekend while he watched football. I looked at Roberta, who had never once, in 12 years, called me by my first name without it sounding like a concession. "Then we'll let the courts sort it out," I said. "I think you should both leave now." Roberta made one more attempt. Something about the children needing stability, about how I was the one disrupting the family. And I stood up, walked to the front door, and opened it. They left. Not quietly. Daniel said something sharp and low on his way out that I chose not to hear clearly. Roberta didn't look at me. The door closed. I stood in my own hallway for a moment in the silence, and then I locked it. I called my mother and told her to keep the kids one more night. She didn't ask many questions. She was my mother. She could hear something in my voice. She said, "Okay, baby, they're fine here." I poured myself a small glass of wine. I sat on the back porch in November in a coat, and I looked at the yard, and I let myself feel it. The full weight of what had just happened. The threat he'd made. The casual brutality of it. A man threatening to damage my professional reputation because he'd been caught. I gave myself 3 days. Not to waver. I was not going to waver. But to breathe. To sleep. To let the adrenaline of the past weeks settle so that the next phase could be handled with a clear head. I told Patricia's office to expect my call Thursday morning. I texted Sandra that things were moving forward. I took a long bath, slept 9 hours, and in the morning, I made the kids breakfast and helped Ethan with a history project and felt somewhere underneath the exhaustion the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. On Saturday, I received a text from Daniel, not from his number, from hers. I didn't know how she had gotten my cell number, perhaps from Daniel's phone, perhaps she was simply brazen enough to find it, but there it was, an unfamiliar number with a Columbus area code, and when I opened it, the message was brief. "I think we should meet. Just the two of us, woman to woman. I'm not your enemy." I read it. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I finished making coffee. Her name, I had learned by then, was Brianna Cole. 29 years old, a marketing coordinator at a firm 2 blocks from Daniel's office. I had found her LinkedIn profile 3 weeks earlier through a few methodical steps I won't detail, and I had forwarded her name and employer to Patricia's office as supplementary documentation. She was not a mysterious figure to me anymore. She was a specific person who had made a specific choice, and she was now, apparently, attempting to manage her situation by reaching out directly to me. I did not respond. I forwarded the text to Patricia. What struck me in those quieter days was how calm I felt. Not numb. I had been numb in the hospital, that flat dissociation of shock. This was different. This was the particular calm of someone who has made a decision and is living inside it. The anger was there, somewhere beneath the surface, but it wasn't driving anything. It was fuel, not fire. Brianna did not text again. Daniel, I was told through Patricia, had retained an attorney, a man named Garrett Webb, whom Patricia described as aggressive but predictable. He had sent over an initial letter suggesting the filing was premature and that both parties should engage in mediation before proceeding. Patricia responded that we were happy to proceed directly through the courts and would not be delaying the timeline. I was at my desk on a Wednesday when my friend Deborah called. Deborah Ashe had been my closest friend since college. 22 years, 2 cities, 3 apartments, and 1 very ugly bridesmaid dress that I wore without complaint. She knew about Daniel. She knew everything. I had called her the night after the hospital discharge, sitting in my car in the driveway, and told her what had happened. She had said very little at the time, just "I'm here," and had let me talk. Now she called to tell me she was coming to Columbus for the weekend. "You don't have to," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm coming anyway." She arrived Friday evening with a bottle of wine and an overnight bag and the specific quality of presence that only old friends have, the ability to sit in a room with you without requiring you to perform okayness. We talked for a long time that first night, about the case, about the kids, about what I was afraid of and what I wasn't afraid of anymore. And then we talked about other things entirely. An absurd trip we'd taken to Portugal in our 20s, a professor we'd both despised, her daughter's obsession with competitive chess. It was the first time in nearly a month that I laughed, really laughed. On Saturday, my mother came over and my sister Lynn drove up from Cincinnati. We had lunch in my kitchen, 4 women around the table I had refinished, and I felt in a way that was almost physical the structure of a life that was still mine. These people, this table, this house. Sandra from next door came by in the afternoon with a casserole and sat on the porch with us for an hour. She told me quietly that she had already given a written statement to Patricia's office, a formal account of what she had witnessed that evening, corroborating the video. She didn't make a production of it. She just said, "I told her what I saw. That's all." That was everything. By Sunday evening, when Deborah packed her bag to drive back to Cleveland, I stood on the porch and felt something I hadn't expected to feel so soon. Steadiness. Not happiness. That was further away still. But steadiness. The sense of feet solidly on the ground. Somewhere across the city, Daniel and Brianna were watching, waiting to see if I would crack. I went inside, made dinner for my kids, and helped Maya rehearse for a school presentation about the water cycle. The plan continued. They came on a Sunday. I didn't know they were coming. There was no warning, no text, no call through attorneys. Just a knock at the door at 11 in the morning while the kids were at Daniel's for the weekend on our interim arrangement. I looked through the sidelight window and saw them standing on my porch. Daniel, and beside him, Roberta. I opened the door. "We just want to talk," Daniel said. His hands were in his coat pockets, and he was using the voice I recognized from 12 years of marriage, the one he deployed when he wanted something and needed me to feel it was my idea to give it, measured, almost gentle. "Can we come in?" I thought about saying no, but I was also curious. I wanted to see what this was. So I stepped back and let them in, and I stood in the middle of my own living room and waited. Roberta sat without being invited. Daniel remained standing. It started with Daniel. He had, he said, done a lot of thinking. He recognized that he had hurt me. He used the word devastated once, applied to how he imagined I must be feeling, which struck me as a strange verb, that he was imagining, not knowing. He said that Brianna had been a mistake. He said it clearly, with eye contact, in a tone that was probably very convincing to anyone who hadn't seen the video. Then Roberta spoke. She was more direct than her son in her way. She talked about the children. She talked about what a prolonged divorce would cost them. Emotionally, developmentally, socially. She used the phrase, broken home, which I noted. She talked about how Daniel was willing to go to counseling, how I was still young enough to rebuild, how sometimes the most mature thing a person could do was set aside pride for the sake of family. Pride. That was the word she chose. I let them finish. Then I said, "So the proposal is that I withdraw the divorce filing, we go to counseling, and what? We don't discuss Brianna? We don't discuss the fact that he brought her into this house while I was in surgery?" "These things take 2 people," Roberta said, quickly, almost ready for the question. There it was, the implication I had expected, that somehow this was partly my doing, that the affair was a symptom of something I had contributed to, and that the correct response was to take my share of the blame and recommit to the marriage, grateful for the opportunity. I looked at Daniel. He didn't contradict his mother. "You threatened my professional reputation," I said to him directly. 2 weeks ago, at that table, you told me you would tell people I fabricated evidence." A pause. "I was upset," he said. "I didn't mean it." "Whether you meant it or not, you said it," I said, and your attorney sent a letter asking us to delay proceedings, which we declined. None of that suggests to me that you're operating in good faith." Roberta's composure shifted, just slightly. The gracious conciliation version of her was giving way to something older and less managed. "You're going to burn this family down," she said, "over your ego." I didn't raise my voice. I had made a decision sometime in the last several weeks that I would not be the person in this story who lost control of herself. I said, "I think you should leave, Roberta. Both of you." Daniel's face changed then. The measured, repentant version of him dropped away entirely. "You know what your problem is, Claire? You've always thought you were the smartest person in the room." His voice was controlled, but his eyes weren't. "This is going to cost you. A lot more than you think." They left. I stood in my living room after the door closed, and I felt it. A real physical sensation, a contraction in my chest. Not heartbreak, fear. The practical, specific fear of a person who understands that she is in a fight with someone who is willing to be ugly about it. I stood there with it for about 2 minutes, and then something interesting happened. The fear converted. It ran through some internal process I hadn't anticipated and came out the other side as clarity. I thought, he is threatening me because he is scared. People who are confident in their position don't threaten. They don't show up unannounced. They don't send their mothers. I called Patricia first thing Monday morning. "They came to the house," I said. A brief silence. "Uninvited?" "Yes." "Good," she said with a precision that I had come to find very comforting. "Document it. Note the date and time, and note everything they said as accurately as you can remember it. This may be relevant." I wrote it all down, every word, including broken home, including your ego, including Daniel's eyes when the mask slipped. I was ready for whatever came next. The moment of full reckoning came in a Columbus courtroom on a gray February morning. Patricia had requested a temporary orders hearing, standard in contested divorce proceedings, to establish interim arrangements for asset management, child custody, and use of the marital home. What had not been standard was what Patricia had spent the preceding weeks assembling with the methodical thoroughness of someone who genuinely loved her work. Daniel arrived with his attorney, Garrett Webb. Brianna was not present, but I had known she might be a factor in the day's proceedings because Patricia had filed a motion to present corroborating evidence of the affair as context for the temporary orders. Webb had objected. The judge had allowed limited presentation. I sat beside Patricia at the plaintiff's table, and I did not look at Daniel. I had made that decision on the drive downtown, that I would not give him the satisfaction of my attention, not even a glance. He could exist in my peripheral vision. That was all he was entitled to now. Webb's opening position was predictable. This was a no-fault dissolution. The temporary orders should be status quo, and the introduction of any third-party evidence was an emotionally motivated attempt to prejudice the proceedings. His tone was confident. He was, as Patricia had warned me, aggressive. He used the word harmonious at one point, describing the marriage, and I had to concentrate carefully on the surface of the table in front of me. Patricia presented in the order she had organized for weeks. First, the video from Sandra's phone, authenticated by Sandra's written statement, time-stamped during the period of my hospitalization. The judge watched it. She made no expression. The courtroom was very quiet during those 43 seconds. I had watched the video so many times by that point that I no longer felt anything acute when it played, only a clean documentary recognition of what it showed. Second, the text message preview I had photographed on Daniel's phone. Patricia's tech consultant had authenticated the metadata. The contact, Mark W., was, Patricia explained, a saved alias for Brianna Cole. She had obtained a corroborating affidavit from a mutual colleague of Daniel and Brianna's who had observed them together on at least 4 occasions during work hours. Third, the financial documentation. Patricia had identified 2 transfers from our joint savings account in November, one for $3,200 and one for $1,100, made by Daniel to a personal account after the divorce was filed. This was a direct violation of the automatic temporary restraining order. Webb objected to this last point loudly. The judge looked at him. "The ATRO was in effect," she said. "The documentation is relevant to the court's ability to assess Mr. Whitfield's compliance with existing orders." I watched Daniel's face during this exchange. Here is what I had not anticipated: how quickly a man can unravel when the story he's been telling himself turns out to be untenable. He had come in that morning believing, I think, that this was still a negotiation, that there were cards to play, narratives to manage. He had that posture, slightly forward, ready. He'd worn his good suit. He'd clearly been told by Webb to project calm. And for the first hour, he had managed it. I could see the effort it was costing him. The jaw set just a degree too tight, the hands folded with just a fraction too much deliberateness. He was performing composure, and performance is exhausting in a room where the documents on the table keep contradicting your script. But the ATRO violation changed the temperature in the room entirely. Webb asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. In the hallway, I could hear Webb's voice, not the words, but the rhythm of someone urgently recalibrating. Daniel's voice answered, higher than I had ever heard it, with the particular pitch of a person whose plan has just failed in public. There was a third voice, too, lower, that I assumed was a paralegal. I sat in the courtroom and drank water from a paper cup, and Patricia made a note on her legal pad without looking up. When we reconvened, something had shifted in Daniel's presentation. He was less polished. He interrupted Webb twice, once to add something unrequested, once to correct a detail that didn't need correcting. When the judge asked him a direct question about the wire transfers, had he been aware of the ATRO at the time he initiated them, he said yes, then immediately said he hadn't thought they applied to that account, which was not a joint account. The contradiction sat in the air of the courtroom like a smell. Patricia introduced documentation showing that the account had, in fact, received joint deposits for 3 years and met the legal definition of a marital asset account. The judge looked at Daniel for a long moment. She had the particular expression of a person who has heard many explanations and has become very good at distinguishing between the ones that are true and the ones that are constructed. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I'm going to need a full accounting of that account's history submitted within 10 days. Daniel nodded. He did not look at me. For the first time that day, I looked directly at him, fully, without flinching. He was staring at the table. He looked, I thought, very tired. In the afternoon session, Patricia called Sandra to give a brief statement. Sandra was exactly what she always was, quiet, factual, and credible. She described what she had seen on the evening in question. She described making the decision to film it and sending me the video. She said she had not been asked to take the video in advance. She had made the decision herself because she thought I should know. She said this last part simply, without drama, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, because it was. Webb cross-examined her and found nothing. He tried twice to suggest that her vantage point had been obscured, and Sandra described calmly and precisely the exact angle from her upstairs window, and exactly what had been visible. She had clearly thought about this moment and prepared for it. I loved her for that. The final thing that happened, the thing I had not planned for but that Patricia had, was that Webb, in a late attempt to reframe the narrative, argued that my conduct in covertly documenting my husband constituted a breach of marital trust. Patricia responded in 2 sentences. My client photographed a screen that was visible and illuminated in a common area of her residence. There was no device access, no hacking, no interception. The documentation is lawful. The judge agreed. By 4 o'clock, the temporary orders were issued. I was granted temporary primary residence of the marital home. The children's primary schedule was structured around my existing involvement record. Patricia's advice to document school pickups and medical appointments for months had not been idle. The joint accounts were frozen under court supervision. Daniel was ordered to provide the financial accounting. I walked out of that courthouse at 4:23 p.m. into cold February air. Patricia fell into step beside me. She pulled on her gloves with the efficient movements of someone who had done this many hundreds of times, in many different weathers, and she said, "Good day." That was all she said. She didn't embellish. She didn't reassure. She simply named what it was. It was enough. The final divorce decree was signed 6 months later, on a warm August afternoon. It didn't happen quickly. There were months of paperwork, of negotiated positions, of Webb attempting various angles that the record consistently failed to support. There were days when I sat in Patricia's office going through documents for 2 hours and emerged into the afternoon feeling scraped clean, like something being prepared rather than finished. I remind you of that because I think it's important. The victory was not seamless. It was accumulated slowly, the way anything real is built. Daniel tried through counsel to argue for a 50-50 asset split that would have required the house to be sold. Patricia demonstrated with documentation I had been accumulating since October that my contributions to the marital home, financially and otherwise, substantially exceeded what a simple arithmetic split would reflect. She presented receipts, records of repairs I had managed, evidence of my income contributions to the mortgage over 12 years, cross-referenced against Daniel's. She was methodical in the way that I had come to understand was her greatest strength. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just relentlessly, patiently thorough. Webb had nowhere to go. The ATRO violation weighed against Daniel at every turn. The judge had not forgotten it. It appeared in her written findings as evidence of a pattern of unilateral financial decision-making during the marriage, a characterization that Patricia had carefully established through additional documentation of other account activity going back 3 years. The violation hadn't just been a mistake. It had become a window. The judge's final asset division gave me the marital home, subject to my refinancing Daniel's name off the mortgage, which my income, she determined, was sufficient to support. I received 60% of the joint savings. My retirement account remained fully mine. Daniel received his pension, his personal accounts, and his car. It was not a vindictive outcome. It was a proportionate one. And somehow that felt better than vindictiveness would have. Custody was structured as I had hoped. Primary physical custody with me, Daniel with every other weekend and 1 evening per week, revisable as the children's needs and schedules developed. The parenting arrangement gave Maya and Ethan stability and continuity, while acknowledging that their daily lives, their school routines, their friends, their activities were anchored with me. The children's college funds, held in my name, remained in my name. Daniel's attorney had threatened in the early months to introduce character witnesses and to challenge my fitness as a parent. Patricia had simply said, "Let him try." He didn't try. The record of my daily involvement with Maya and Ethan, 214 log entries over 8 months, was not something anyone was eager to dispute in open court. 214 entries. School pickups, pediatric appointments, school conferences, soccer practices, dentist visits, homework sessions, sick days when I worked from home and kept a record of that too. Every entry was time-stamped. Every entry was factual. I had built an architecture of evidence around my own ordinary life, and it had held. Roberta said nothing more, publicly. She had attended 2 hearings and left both times looking as if she had bitten into something unexpected. She had arrived at the first hearing in November in a good coat and an expression of determined authority, as though her presence alone might recalibrate the proceedings in her son's favor. By the second hearing in January, the coat was the same, but the authority had gone quiet. She sat in the gallery and watched and said nothing. She called me once in April, and I let it go to voicemail. The message was long and not particularly coherent. Something about family, something about what I was teaching the children, something that circled back on itself several times without arriving anywhere. I deleted it. Brianna Cole's role in the proceedings was limited but documented. Her name appeared in the affidavit. She had retained her own counsel briefly, I was told, when it seemed her name might feature more prominently. But Patricia had never intended to make Brianna the story. Brianna was a detail. She lost her job regardless, not because of anything I did, but because Daniel's colleague who had provided the corroborating affidavit was Brianna's direct supervisor, and the professional complications that followed were apparently significant. I learned this secondhand, through the ordinary channels of a city that is smaller than it seems. I felt nothing in particular about it. She had made choices. Choices have weight. The moment I want to tell you about, though, the real ending, was smaller than a courtroom. It was quieter than a judge's ruling. It required no attorneys and produced no documents. It was a Sunday in August, 3 days before the decree was signed. I was in the backyard with Maya and Ethan. It was the kind of afternoon that Ohio produces sometimes in late summer, still and golden, the light thick and unhurried, the air carrying a faint smell of cut grass and something faintly sweet from a neighbor's garden. Maya was reading on the porch swing, her feet pulled up beneath her, entirely absorbed. Ethan was attempting to teach himself to juggle with 3 oranges, with results that were increasingly catastrophic and increasingly funny. The 3rd orange had already rolled under the porch twice, and he retrieved it each time with the absolute seriousness of someone who is committed to a project. I was sitting in the yard with my bare feet in the grass and a book open in my lap that I wasn't reading. I was just sitting. The monitor was gone. The IV was gone. The hospital ceiling was gone. The courtroom, the documents, the careful maintenance of my own composure over months, all of it temporarily just gone. I thought, this is mine. Not the yard, not specifically. The yard was always just a yard, just grass and a fence and a sky. But this, the afternoon, the children, the particular quality of peace that had settled in my chest like something that had been looking for the right place to land. I had come through something real. I was standing on the other side of it. And the life on this side was smaller in some ways, quieter, less certain in its shape, and larger in others. And it was, without qualification or asterisk, mine. Daniel signed the decree 3 days later without requesting a final hearing. His attorney submitted the signature page by email. It arrived in Patricia's inbox at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. She forwarded it to me with a single line, "It's done. Congratulations, Claire." I sat at my desk and read those 4 words. I closed my laptop. I went to the window of my office and looked out at the Columbus skyline for a few minutes. The ordinary skyline of a Midwestern city on a Tuesday in August. Nothing dramatic about it, just buildings and sky and traffic and the ordinary ongoing world. I refinanced the mortgage in my name alone in September. The banker who processed the paperwork made some small approving comment about my credit score, and I almost laughed out loud. I called Deborah that evening. We talked for 2 hours. At some point she said, "How do you feel?" And I sat with the question, really sat with it, the way you sit with a question when you intend to answer it honestly. And I said, "Clean, like the windows got washed." She laughed. I laughed. And I thought, yes, that's exactly it. The year that followed was not a dramatic reinvention. I stayed in Columbus. I stayed in the house. I repainted the living room in the spring and bought the couch I'd wanted for years. I started running mornings along the river trail, not as therapy, just because it turned out I liked it. At work, I was promoted to senior account director in March. The raise, combined with my refinanced mortgage, meant I was more financially stable than I'd been at almost any point in my adult life. There's a particular dignity in that, in knowing every figure in your account represents exactly what you earned. Maya got into photography. I bought her a secondhand DSLR and drove her to parks and sunrises, and her photographs were genuinely good. I framed one and hung it in the hallway. Ethan made the school soccer team. I was at every home game, rain or shine, with terrible coffee and a voice that deteriorated badly by the second half. These were the things that had always mattered. I had simply been at risk of losing the framework that made them possible. Daniel and Brianna moved in together that fall. By February, I heard through a mutual friend that they were struggling. Money, arguments, the weight of what they'd built the relationship on. By the following spring, they had separated. Daniel lost his job in a restructuring that autumn, and managing child support on reduced income created real strain. He called once to discuss the arrangement. I gave him Patricia Holt's number. Roberta called once in the winter. I let it go to voicemail and deleted it without listening past the first 30 seconds. Sandra planted a Japanese maple in her front yard that spring. When I came out one morning and saw it, small, barely established, brilliantly red, she was watching from her porch. "Solidarity," she said. I laughed until my eyes watered.